There are very real skills in planning, and it's important that we try to grasp some of these. And I want to be very practical now and just teach you some of these skills. First and most important is, what has God said? It is important that we really know that what we're planning towards is something that was birthed in heaven. Because then we have the faith to move towards it, and when we meet difficulties, and there will be challenges, there will be hindrances, there will be opposition, it's very important that we can go back to the start and say, well, we know that God has said, therefore we're going to press on. Nehemiah, they faced many, many difficulties. There was opposition from Tobiah, from Sanballat and others who tried to discourage them. But because Nehemiah knew what God had said, they pressed on, and they weren't daunted, they weren't put off. They didn't give up building the wall. And they were very successful, and they achieved that in just those 7 weeks plus. So what has God said? Next, once we know the broad goal, we need to learn how to create ideas, how to create thinking around developing a strategy, about all the little jobs that have got to be done in practical terms. And I want to teach you a technique which I call a spider diagram. Some call it a mind map. And it's a way of getting down on paper all the different things that you need to be thinking about. It's very powerful. It can be carried out by yourself, or it can be carried out with a team. And we'll look at some of the practicalities of that. What does a mind map look like? Well, this is a mind map about this set of talks that I'm giving to you. I've put there right in the center the word planning, and then off to the sides I've drawn legs to various different aspects related to that. And I'll show you in a moment just how we do that. But first of all, as we're creating ideas, and particularly I'm talking now about doing it with a team, we do need to have some rules. What are the rules of the game? If you can imagine a room with perhaps 4, 5, 6 people in, and it's been decided that we're going to hold an event, maybe we're going to hold an event next June, which will be an outreach event out of which perhaps we want to see people saved and plant a church in a particular area. We need to know what the rules of the game are that we're just about to play, as it were. As we create these ideas, what are the rules that we're going to observe amongst those half dozen or so people? So first of all, that every idea is acceptable. What we're looking for here is creativity. We know where we're going. We're wanting to hold an event in such and such a town next June with the thought that one day it'll become a church. So we know where we're going, but how are we going to get there? What are all the different things we need to think about in order to be able to achieve that end? And we're wanting people to be very creative. We don't want it all to be directed by the leader. We want to involve everyone on an equal basis. And so it's important that any idea that someone puts forward is seen as being totally acceptable. We don't stop and discuss it until later. We accept the idea, we write it down somewhere, and then we'll move on. We won't debate the idea, we won't judge the idea. We don't say, oh, that's a stupid idea, we could never do that. Why? Because if you do that, the person who's made the idea will feel rejected, and they'll just shut up. They won't offer another idea, because it hurts to be criticized publicly. And so we accept all the ideas and we discuss nothing until later. And those are really just the basic rules. There are just those two. So now let's just have a look at how we do this. And I'm going to demonstrate that with the help of a flip chart. So when we're doing a spider diagram, we start with the event in the middle, which we're saying is a June outreach. And then you produce various legs as you think of the next item. So program would obviously be one of them. And from that we can then produce speaker, worship, PA, which then reminds me of video. So I just let my mind flow freely as I'm doing this. Finance would be another one. There's no particular order in which to do this. You need to have a budget. Transport may be another one. You may want to be bringing people in. Are we going to use buses or cars? Catering, is there going to be any catering? And so you just gradually let it develop more and more. Venue is obviously a major one. And in order to decide the venue, how big? Are you going to need breakout rooms for something like ministry afterwards? Then the venue, you've also got the stage and the design of that, size, so that all goes with the stage. Then we're going to have part of the program, maybe the ministry team. Do we want to have ministry team? They will need training. And the venue, you're going to need to have stewards to welcome people and show them to their seats. Are they going to need training as well? There's the whole matter of advertising or publicity. That can come in many forms. Obviously adverts, both paper and media, which could be radio or could be the television. Paper, you're going to have to design a flyer. You're going to have to get that printed, and you're going to have to get it distributed. Notice that I'm not stopping and talking about any of these things in terms of explaining what they are or discussing whether it's good or bad, or I'm just trying to get lots of words down as they come to my mind at the moment, so that we can then come back and process them later. So there we have all the kind of key features, I suspect, but there may be a lot of other things to come in there. Under finance, for instance, are you going to have an offering? I've got to talk about cash handling to make sure that's secure. The budget, that's probably enough on that. Are there other speakers? Are you going to have seminars? If it's an all-day event, you might have breakout seminars conceivably. Are you going to have children's work? It all depends what this event is that you're reaching out for. Let's just count up and see how many we have got. We've taken probably 2 minutes, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. So we've got 34 individual words in 2 minutes. That's not bad. And if there was a group of you doing this, you would get a lot more. The limitation has really been how fast I can write, and also I've been doing it a little more slowly, to be honest, than I would normally do, just to be able to communicate what I'm doing as I've done it. Normally I'm doing this very quickly, just on any bit of paper, as the words come to mind. Now the next stage is to get hold of those and think about each one in more depth, and you can then add 1 or 2 things, Or you might even delete one or two things. So you might go through and say, no, we're not going to have children's work, that's not relevant. There may be things that you want to delete. And so you go through doing that, and then you turn that into a timeline together with whoever is going to take the action to make it come about. Well, now that we have done that exercise and you've seen how I approach the matter of creating the various legs and so on, I want you to have a go at it yourself. I'd like you to get into groups of perhaps 2 or 3. And I want you to develop a spider diagram of the sort that I've just shown you as a way of creating ideas and planning needs for a guest service in your church. So get together in 2s and 3s, and you don't have to come from the same church, you can imagine that. And get together in 2s and 3s and just spend 5 minutes, and that's all you need, to write down as many ideas as you can of things that need to be done, created ideas that you need to discuss and so on. And remember, accept everything and discuss nothing as you do that. Okay, now we're going to just recap. Where have we been? We're looking at planning skills, and we've said that the most important starting point is what has God said. Then, using the spider diagram method, we have created lots of ideas and written down lots of things that need to be done. But you can't leave it just in a kind of random picture, which is maybe even a bit untidy. You've got to bring some order to it. And so we need to order our thoughts. And you'll notice how the legs tended to focus on particular areas that were related to the main thrusts of your planning: finance, venue, personnel, and so on. And so we take hold of these various thoughts and we group them together, we add to those legs, we maybe cross out some of the items that were on the diagram that were indeed ideas that are not appropriate to implement. And we begin to bring some order and some shape to that diagram. Not for the sake of the diagram, but for the sake of our thinking. Because what we then need to do is to transfer all of that information onto a timeline. What we've done is to get a whole plethora of good ideas and of actions that needed to be taken. And as we've grouped them and reviewed them, we've added a few things in. And so probably on that bit of paper, that spider diagram, by the time we've finished this exercise, you've probably got well over 90% of all the things that you're going to need to do between now and the event. They're all there because you've been in a creative mode together where you've been trying to think of these ideas. And so we now need to put them on a timeline. And I'm going to assume that this event is taking place in June and that we're now standing at the beginning of March. And on that spider diagram there may be 50, 60 different things, and clearly for this presentation I can't handle that number of items. So what I've done is to take a dozen or so, and I've put them onto a timeline in the way that I would plan this going forward. And so I'll say down at the bottom there that the event is going to take place in June. We're now in March, so I will start to create a vertical table with the calendar month and the week beginning. So I've got March the 13th for a couple of the items, March the 20th for a couple of the items, and so on. And so in the week beginning, there are certain activities that were on the spider diagram that now need to be brought onto this table as a way of getting order. And we also put onto that table who is going to do it. So if we just go down this list, we've got first of all booking the venue. So we're moving to another town, We're hoping to plant a church there one day. We've got a party of people who will go out there and will have a look around. Maybe you've got 2 or 3 families there that you're going to work with, and you get some recommendations about possible venues for holding this outreach event. And you go and have a look at it, you find out who runs it, see whether it's available on the date you want, and make a booking. And that's so important because you don't want to get caught out by not having the venue in place well in advance. You don't leave that to the last moment. You're going to want to produce publicity and so on, and that venue needs to be put on there. Which takes us to the next item on this agenda, and that is planning the advertising. It's no good setting up an event if no one's going to come to it because they didn't know it was happening. And so you need to think carefully about how are we going to communicate. Are we going to use literature? Are we going to use the broadcast media? How are we going to communicate? Are we going on the internet? Have we got a Facebook page? All sorts of ways. And so we need to plan the advertising. And that needs to come early. And in both cases, it's the administrator and his team who would look after those. They would make the booking. They would deal with the communication aspects. Then a week later, we need to be deciding, well, who's going to be the speaker? Are we going to invite someone in from outside? Maybe even from overseas. If it is from overseas, 3 months may not be a long enough lead time. We may be too late, because typically someone who travels internationally as a speaker is booked up well in advance. And so we decide who the speaker will be, and that becomes the responsibility of the elder, maybe the lead elder. He's going to invite that speaker to come and speak on this special occasion. In the letter he will send the detail of what the event is, why it's being held, what the goals are for the event, and so on. So it's kind of peer-to-peer. It's an elder to another elder somewhere in the country or in the world. And very early on as well, you need to have a financial budget. Every event of this sort costs a lot of money. And we need to know in advance, what is this going to cost us? Because it may need special fundraising, or it may mean you have to cut back on plans because you haven't got the funding. It may mean that you need to mobilize the church to pray in faith in order to release this amount of finance. Until you have written down a financial budget and know how much money you're wanting to gather in order to spend on this event, you're really in danger of overspending and overcommitting. And so that planning of the budget is vital, and we'll talk about handling finance on another occasion. So we've done the early things, and we then move on into April, and there we start to design and print the literature so that it's ready for distribution. And I put that in the 10th of April, the week beginning the 10th. So a couple of weeks in, we've had Easter maybe. We then get down to some practical things. And then we ought to start planning the stage design. If this is going to be a high profile sort of event, broadcast on the media perhaps, maybe you're going to put it onto some special TV presentation that you do. The platform and the backcloths and so on, they need careful thought, so that it's not something you think about at the last moment. You need to get someone to design it, get the color schemes right, get the lighting levels right, and so on. That needs a lot of work. And so 2 months out, you need to be well into that and beginning to think about it. Then we get into May, and possibly a little late, but I put down that we might book the media slots there if you're going to broadcast on the radio or on the television some adverts about this event. You'll know what is relevant in your own particular setting on that. And then in the middle of May, the lead elder stands up on a Sunday morning and he puts the people in the picture with how far the planning has got, and then says, now we need to start distributing the literature. And you work out a way of doing that and you present that to the people. Maybe house to house, maybe through the shops, maybe putting little stacks of leaflets in key stores where people go. Again, this is very local in terms of the decision that you're wanting to make. It's relevant to your culture, your setting. But I'm trying to here just to convey the idea of getting hold of those ideas off the spider diagram and putting them on a timeline so that you're sure that you're doing things in the right order. You're creating what's sometimes called a critical path, so that you're doing things in the right order. And then, because you're expecting people to be saved, and maybe you expect signs and wonders, that's a great way of seeing people saved. If you've got signs and wonders, you have signs so that people wonder. So you're expecting to see people healed, perhaps, maybe delivered from demonic possession. And you'll need a ministry team. And you don't just get the youngest convert, you get some mature people together and train them up so that they can be ready to minister at the end of the meeting to people in their place of need. Then we move into June, and we're starting to think very much more in a focused way about the specifics of the event itself. And so you start to train stewards, so there are people who are good at welcoming as people come into the venue. There are people who are making sure that all the chairs are filled, that they're laid out well, that there's enough ventilation, that the lighting levels are good, and so on. And then you bring more training to the ministry team. Maybe on 3 or 4 different occasions you need to build up that ministry training, and some more of that can take place in June. And then you come to the event itself, which I've pulled the 21st of June out as being the date on which this event will happen. And then, of course, immediately afterwards you do want to have a debrief. You want to review what it is that you've achieved, whether you've accomplished the outcomes you expected, what you can learn from the way the event ran. Did it go well? Were there some problems? Were there some things that have been forgotten? All sorts of detail. And that then provides you with a planning document for the next occasion on which you run a similar event. Now, as I say here, just for the sake of this presentation, I've just chosen this small number of actions that came off our spider diagram. But the reality is that all 50, 60 items from that need to go onto a timeline. And the reason for doing that is so that everyone involved can know who's responsible for doing what and when. So that you're not relying on the lead elder or the chief administrator, whoever that might be, to all the time be remembering and finding people to do such and such a job. No, it's laid out carefully in advance so that people do the right thing at the right time. And then personally, when I'm carrying out this process, I have a system of people feeding back to me how far they've got in their actions, in the things that they were responsible for. You can do this even on the internet. You can have some sort of place where you gather this information. You can put this document into some common pool and people can access it so that they can fill in when the action's been taken, whether there were any consequences and so on. So it's a very good way of just getting a total process going that everyone understands and that everyone builds to and engages with. And so we've said that we want to start with what has God said. We then created some ideas using a spider diagram. We then ordered our thoughts by looking at the spider diagram, adding a few items, taking off a few items, and now we've just created a timeline. And then, of course, there's the financial budget. That's another planning skill that is so important. I cannot overstress the importance of careful financial budgeting. Sometimes people just say, well, we'll just spend the money as it comes in. After the offering, we'll distribute it to whoever needs it. And that can be a practical way of handling the money. But you need to have some sort of overall feel of what money you're expecting to come in and what money is going to be spent. And if your expenditure exceeds your income, you have to make some changes in your thinking. You have to perhaps decide whether or not you're going to charge a fee. Are you going to take an offering? There have to be other sources of income before you can spend the money. And you find that in Luke chapter 14, Jesus said, "For which of you, desiring to build a tower, doesn't first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it?" Well, that's budgeting. How much are we going to need to complete this tower? How much are we going to need to complete this event? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, "The man began to build and was not able to finish." Now, that's not a great testimony. If you set out publicly to run an event, and then for reasons of lack of planning, lack of foresight, lack of financial budgeting, you find you run out of money and have to cancel the event, it doesn't bring credit to you. It doesn't, even more important, bring credit to the Lord, because you've not carried out with diligence good practice in order to achieve the things that he's laid on your heart. And so what we've done is to say we need to know what God has said. We created some ideas. We then ordered our thoughts. And now, how about monitoring and accountability? How do you know whether you're on track to achieve the event on the date set? We need to spend a little time just having a look at this. First of all, what will you do? If you're going to monitor something, you have to lay down first what it is you're going to do in the planning stage. And that's what planning is all about, that you lay it down very, very clearly so that you know what you're trying to do. You can then monitor it. And then when you will do it. Well, we've looked at the timeline, so you've now got that in place. You've now got the ability to say, are we up to speed? Are we where we expected to be by the end of April? If not, you have to take some corrective action. And it's much easier to take that corrective action when you're still several weeks away from the event than when you're tight up against the event and it suddenly becomes a crisis and you panic. One important part of doing this is to say, well, how will I know whether I've achieved such and such a thing? In many cases, it's very obvious. The action defines how you will know, because you've either done that action or not. But if you're planning towards a ministry, and we've been tending to focus on an event so far, if you're planning towards a ministry, there need to be some tangible ways in which you can say, well, we know we've achieved our goal because. Maybe it's a school that you're thinking of starting up, and you set goals of your intake. You set goals about the rate at which you'll build new classrooms. And you then need to be able to, at certain points in time, say, well, are we on track? How do we know? Well, because the intake was 50 at the beginning of this year, or because it was not. And so you can monitor how you are progressing, particularly by having measurable things that you can actually count, you can quantify, and you know whether you're on track or not. So you have an indicator. That's what you will observe has changed. So it's 50 children, it's 3 classrooms. You have that. And then how are you going to monitor that? How are you going to know whether your expectation and your observation is correct? And this becomes very relevant if it's more of a qualitative than a quantitative improvement you're wanting to make. So it may be that you are wanting to reach out to street children, and you want to bring them into some sort of environment where they can be helped. And at the end of 6 months, someone comes to you and says, well, how are you getting on? And you say, well, I think they're doing great. You know, don't they look much happier? And that's good. But what you really want to do at the beginning is to say, well, within 6 months, we will have contacted 20 children. We will have brought them into our facility on at least once every 2 weeks basis. And we will expect them to have learnt a certain amount of discipline, or we'll expect them to have learnt some reading. Maybe you're going to provide some extra tuition from their school. And you need to state what these are so that you have some means of verification. So it's not good enough just to be able to say, well, the children look a lot happier, don't they? Now, if you're going to be teaching them reading, you need to say, well, our goal is to get through book 1 of a particular reading program. And so there your means of verification is to say, well, have we got through book 1? We can't just say, well, they seem to be reading a bit now where they weren't before. No, have we got through book 1? Was that a realistic expectation? Or do we need to back off? And in the next cycle, do we need to say, well, those books were not suitable? We need to have a different way of teaching reading. So that's the monitoring and accountability. And we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail at a later stage. But what about the implementing of the plan? Let's just return to the story with Nehemiah. How did he actually implement the plan? Well, first of all, he delegated with accountability. We saw at the beginning of that chapter 3, I referred to Eliashib, the high priest, and he arose with his brothers, the priests, who built the sheep gate. So you sense that Eliashib there was the team leader, that he mobilized his brothers, the priests, and together they built the gate. And so delegation of that particular part of the wall has been very clearly allocated to this family group. And the accountability comes through Eliashib. If Nehemiah wants to know what's going on, he will go to Eliashib and say, how's it going? How's the team doing? Is the wall going up? And because Eliashib is the team leader with those priests, he will know the answer to those questions. Teamwork is a very important part of implementation. Eliashib was just one team leader among many as they rebuilt that wall. And certainly as I have implemented many programs over the years, I've tended to think of having a management team, those who are giving the leadership to the whole event, and then delegating to other teams to actually carry out much of the implementation. So as I have run conferences, for instance, one has had different teams looking after different aspects of the conference needs. One team might look after the venue and all that goes with it, the chairs and so on. Another would look after communication, the literature, the videoing, the audio recording of messages. Another would look after the worship, another the program, and so on. And so you have a lot of different teams. And they're all part of one big team, which is my team, but there are teams that are themselves accountable to their team leader. As a family of churches, many years ago, God spoke to us. He said that we were to work like a fleet, like a task force. If you can picture a fleet going to war on behalf of the nation, they have to have certain ships in that fleet in order to provide a cohesive whole as they make their attack. So you need an aircraft carrier to carry the aircraft that will give the air cover and protection for the fleet. You have submarines who will give the underwater protection. You'll have supply vessels who will provide all that is needed for the fleet. The provisions, the oil, the food and so on. You have the destroyers, those who can actually go to battle firing guns. And so you've got these different ships, these different boats in the task force, each of which brings a particular characteristic, a particular quality for the benefit of all. And the same is true when you're putting on an event. So you want to line up the worship leaders and worship band to look after that aspect. You want to line up a team of stewards or ushers to look after the handling of the meeting practicalities, like chair layout, like handing out notice sheets, like taking an offering, and so on. You need a catering team perhaps if it's an all-day conference, or you're going to provide some catering at the end of the event, and so on. And so you have these different teams that together come together to form the whole team. And as team leader of the whole event, I will rely hugely on the leaders of those individual teams to bring their team accountability. So if there's a problem within their team, that's their responsibility, not mine. And I expect them to look after the pastoral care of that team to make sure they're all fully in the picture, and so on. One of the biggest events that I was ever involved in running would have been the Stoneleigh Bible Week. There we had, on the final year, 28,000 people. There are a lot of teams that are needed to make such an event run. Now, I wasn't actually ultimately responsible for running that event, but I was very involved in it. And there were different teams across the site looking after different aspects, even such unglamorous things as cleaning the toilets. But the whole purpose is that all these teams work together so that the people who are attending the event are not being hindered by inefficiency, by the toilets not flushing, for instance, but they're able to focus on going to meetings, to hear from God, to sense what God is saying to them, to what are sometimes called the takeaways, the things that they will go away from the event with. That's the important part of it. And behind the scenes you have these many teams who are then servicing the whole program. And the teams will typically reflect the skills and character of the leaders, so that in a conference you may run some children's ministry alongside it. And you go to churches, which we saw as being the relationship of a ship is a church, if the whole event is the fleet. You'll go to particular churches who have clearly shown skills in running good children's work, and you'll give to them the responsibility of looking after the children's ministry. And so you're tapping in on the gifting that God has made available to you. And then, of course, there is the God-man partnership. Ultimately, this is all of God, and we're there just to serve Him and to work with Him. But in Nehemiah 4 and verses 9 to 23, we read such things as this. We prayed to our God, and because of them, that's the opposition that was coming at that stage, because of them we set up a guard against them day and night. And so they asked God for wisdom, and then they did something very practical. It was a partnership. Opposition was coming. They had people shouting from outside the wall, discouraging them, and they prayed to their God and then took action. And so there was a partnership in there. And in verse 15 we read, "And it happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us," in other words the plan that they had hatched against them, "and that God had frustrated their plan, then all of us returned to the wall, each one to his work." And you see, the enemies who were trying to oppose Nehemiah rebuilding the wall, they recognized that God was with the Jews in partnership, and that as they mounted their guard and as they wouldn't take any notice of the rumors and things that were being shouted at them, so they backed off, because they recognized that their God was with them, it says. Motivation is another very important quality to build into your team as you're planning and as you're implementing a plan. They need to be well motivated. They should never feel, oh, we've got to do it because he said so. No, they should be carrying their own motivation, their own excitement, their own anticipation of being blessed through the event. Maybe not in the way that all the other delegates will be, but in some way that God will bless them for their faithful service. Let us read verses 12 to 14 of this chapter 4. It came about when the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, "They will come up against us from every place where they may turn." Then I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, the exposed places, and I stationed the people in families with their swords and spears and bows. And when I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people. "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses." What Nehemiah is doing here is motivating them by showing them first that God is with them, and then a reason for being diligent and for fighting, for the protection of their families, of their houses, and so on. "Do not be afraid. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sisters, your daughters, your wives, and your houses." That's real motivation, isn't it? If you're fighting for them. And so we have the importance of motivation and of people being well motivated. And then we come on to leadership involvement. We saw earlier how some of the leaders, the Tekoite nobles, refused to get involved. They were not good leaders. Nehemiah, on the other hand, we read in chapter 5 and verses 14 to 16, we see, "Moreover, from the day that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year of the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, for 12 years, neither I nor my kinsmen have eaten the governor's food allowance." So it was recognized that as governor, he could have special food. He could have a special allowance compared to the others, but he chose not to take it. "But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants domineered the people. But I did not do so, because of the fear of God." You see, he chose to set aside some of the privileges that he could have received. I think often we find in our nations that ministers and so on will use their position to better their own situation through corruption, through bribery. Nehemiah was above that because he feared God. And more than that, in verse 16 it says, "I also applied myself to the work on this wall. We did not buy any land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work." He also applied himself. He was there with a trowel, laying the cement, putting the bricks on, putting the blocks on, whatever it was that they were doing. He got very involved. And that's a great example. It is, of course, as Jesus worked, he always set the example. Whether it was washing the disciples' feet, whether it was saying, "Well, I'm not going to sleep in a house. We'll find somewhere to sleep out here in the open. I don't expect special treatment." No, he set an example which is a huge contrast to so much in the world, isn't it? And the church must always be that contrast. Leaders must always be prepared to get involved. I'm always very reluctant to ask anyone to do anything that I've not personally done myself at some stage, so that I know what's involved. I know the challenges, I know the difficulties, and I can, if necessary, give advice. But above all, so that I can set an example. With the big event that I mentioned, the Stoneleigh Bible Week, I would always make sure that I was one of the very last people to leave the site at the end of that Bible Week. It used to take 2 or 3 days to clear the site after everyone had gone home. And I would go out on the site and I would pick up the necessary tools and pull stuff down and dig stuff up and do whatever was necessary to restore the site to its former situation. So we left it in a better condition than we found it. And I knew that people were very tired doing that. So I was going to stay there till the end, in order to set an example, in order to motivate, in order to encourage. It was no good me driving away saying, well, I'll leave you to get on with it. No, I needed to be involved, to set the example. And so we find that once this has gone successfully, we can say, well, mission accomplished. As indeed it was with the walls. The walls were built. We find in chapter 6, verses 15 and 16, the wall was completed on the 25th day of the month Elul, in 52 days. And it came about when all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence. Why? For they recognized that the work had been accomplished with the help of our God. And surely that needs to be our testimony, doesn't it? That as we come to the end of any particular event or ministry or public happening, we want people to say, God was with them. That's why it went so well. I just urge you to make that your aim, always, so that you can say, well, I did this to the glory of God, and He was with us. He gave me the energy, He gave me the wisdom, He gave me the skills to carry it out. We're going to end this session there, and next time we will talk about planning a ministry. Our focus has been very much on planning an event in this session, but we need to move on to planning a ministry, which you handle a little differently.